Welcome to the debate. What if the very trait that makes you, the smartest person in the room, like your ability to build this airtight, logically flawed argument, is actually the exact same trait that guarantees you will lose the negotiation?
It is a fascinating paradox, honestly.
It really is. I mean, we typically imagine a master negotiator as someone armed with an irrefutable briefcase of facts, right? Just cutting through the noise to secure a victory. But when you encounter the actual psychological landscape of two human beings trying to reach an agreement, that heavy binder of logic often looks less like a tool and, well, a lot more like a barrier.
Yeah, because we are looking at a dynamic that is far less about establishing empirical truth and far more about navigating human complexity, which completely upends the conventional wisdom of conflict resolution.
Exactly. So today, we are examining a central question drawn directly from our source material regarding the negotiator's toolkit. In the context of negotiation, does relying on argumentation and logical reasoning inherently create an obstacle to success, or is it a necessary mechanism that has simply been misunderstood?
Right.
This discourse emerges from text that fundamentally challenges the traditional view of negotiation, specifically questioning the utility of logic versus relational awareness. And I take the position that argumentation inherently forces an adversarial win-lose dynamic that actively ignores the emotional realities of decision-making.
And I take the opposing stance. I argue that abandoning evidence and logic deprives negotiators of the very framework they absolutely must have to, uncover and actually align those differing interests.
Well, let me outline my perspective first, which is deeply rooted in the premise of our source text. The material posits that argumentation, which we have historically championed as the primary tool of the negotiator, operates on a fundamentally flawed assumption.
Which is?
It assumes that if you just bring enough evidence, and if your logical reasoning is sound enough, you will inevitably convince the other party. But as the text rightly points out, human decisions are rarely made on purely rational grounds.
Sure, they aren't purely rational, but
But when we rely on argumentation, we completely neglect the emotional and relational aspects at play. We turn what should be a collaborative problem-solving effort into this ego-driven debate. And the moment it becomes a debate, each side just seeks to win. The mechanism of arguing inherently blinds us to the underlying interests of the person sitting across from us because, well, we are too busy constructing our next logical offensive.
I come at it from a completely different way. I certainly concede that imposing one's will, entering a room with the sole intention of bludgeoning the other party into submission with facts, is counterproductive.
Highly counterproductive.
Right, and the text is absolutely right to warn against that specific behavior. But where I fundamentally diverge is the text's conflation of argumentation with opposition. They're not the same thing. The source material advocates for reaching a mutual understanding of underlying interests.
Yes, exactly.
Right. But my core premise is that achieving this mutual understanding is practically impossible without the precise articulation of evidence and logical reasoning. How do we understand an interest if we cannot logically define it, test its boundaries, and articulate exactly how it interacts with our own constraints? Logic isn't the enemy of understanding. It is the vocabulary of understanding.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how this actually operates in practice. Approaching a human negotiation with pure logic and brilliant arguments is like trying to use a highly detailed map of the London Underground to navigate the open ocean.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The tool you are holding is incredibly sophisticated, right? It is internally consistent. It is mathematically perfect. But it is entirely inappropriate for the fluid, emotional, and relational environment you are actually floating in.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that even the ocean has underlying logic?
How so?
Well, it has currents, it has tidal patterns, it has atmospheric pressures that dictate its behavior. If we accept your premise and the text's premise that decisions are rarely made on purely rational grounds, we are suddenly stepping into very dangerous territory where we treat human emotion as this entirely chaotic, unsolvable mystery.
I'm not saying it's unsolvable.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it is. Let's ground this in a real-world scenario. Let's say we are negotiating a high-stakes corporate acquisition. The founder of the company being acquired is pushing back against a perfectly fair market valuation.
Okay, classic scenario.
Right. Now, a purely emotional reading tells us that the founder is terrified of losing their legacy and their life's work. That is an emotion. But it triggers specific, predictable, logical needs. If decisions aren't rational at some level, how can we reliably solve that founder's problem?
You solve the problem by addressing the human, not the math. I mean, if you're listening to this right now and you're a lawyer or a data analyst or an engineer, you might be screaming at your dashboard, thinking like, but the facts are the facts. If the valuation multiples are correct, the founder just needs to see the data.
Because they do need to see the data.
And that is exactly the danger that text specifically calls out as the assumption that evidence and reasoning alone can convince the other party. Let's look at the mechanism of what is actually happening in that founder's brain. When you slide a spreadsheet across the table proving their company's only worth, say, $20 million, they don't process that as a math problem.
Right, but
They process it as a threat to their identity.
the spreadsheet isn't the entirety of the negotiation. It's the baseline.
But the moment you rely on it as your primary tool, you trigger a physiological response. Neuroscience tells us that when a person feels their core identity or beliefs are being attacked, even by objective facts, their amygdala engages. Cortisol floods their system.
Okay, yes, the amygdala hijack.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for that logical reasoning you value so highly, literally diminishes in function. By relying on an argument to prove your point, you are factually making the other person less rational. You cannot hand someone a spreadsheet proving they shouldn't feel disrespected.
Well, obviously not.
So when the text explicitly states that argumentation neglects the emotional and relational aspects, aren't you proving its point by insisting we drag human emotion into a rigid logical framework?
Not at all. Because recognizing an emotion and incorporating it into a durable solution actually requires reasoning. Empathy without logic is just shared wallowing.
Shared wallowing? That's a bit dismissive.
But it's true. Let's go back to our founder who feels they are losing their legacy. The relational awareness, the empathy, tells me that they feel threatened. But the logical reasoning allows us to figure out how to restructure the agreement so that the structural cause of that threat is removed.
How does logic do that better than relational trust?
Here is the mechanism. We use logic to draft a highly specific, legally binding addendum that guarantees the founder 2 seats on the executive board for the next 5 years and establishes an independent innovation lab under their direct control. That is a complex, logical, evidence-based argument being deployed to solve an emotional grievance.
I see the result, but
Text claims argumentation creates a dynamic of opposition. But I argue that reasoning together to find that specific board seat solution is the highest form of respect. It says, I value your underlying interests enough to rigorously examine them with you.
that's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. You are describing a beautiful outcome, but you're skipping over the anatomy of the process required to get there. We need to look at the anatomy of opposition.
Okay, let's look at it.
The source explicitly warns that by arguing, we risk turning the exchange into a debate where each side seeks to win rather than collaborate. Think about the very structure of an argument. It requires a premise, a counterpremise, a defense, and a refutation. It is inherently adversarial.
Only if you treat it that way.
But the moment you start rigorously examining someone's underlying interests through the lens of argumentation, the relational dynamic instantly shifts. It moves from we are solving a problem together to I am right and here is the empirical evidence why your current stance is wrong.
But that assumes the only way to utilize evidence is as an assault weapon. I'm suggesting a completely different paradigm for how we view debate in a room. Think of argumentation not as a tug of war where one person ends up in the mud, but as 2 architects stress testing a blueprint.
A blueprint.
Yes, pointing out structural flaws in a design isn't seeking to win, it's ensuring the building doesn't collapse on both of you. How can we possibly solve a complex logistical problem if we don't logically stress test the underlying interests?
Because human beings are not blueprints.
But their business problems are.
If that founder tells me their underlying interest is to rapidly expand the company's regional distribution after the acquisition, and my data scientists have evidence that the regional market is entirely saturated, sharing that evidence isn't me trying to defeat them. It is me collaborating with them to prevent a mutual failure.
I appreciate the architect analogy, but again, architects are dealing with inanimate objects. They are calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel, glass, and concrete. In a negotiation, you are dealing with ego, fear, pride, and historical grievances.
Right, but you still have to deal with the steel and concrete of the actual deal.
True. But if you treat a person's underlying interest, which is often deeply tied to their self-worth, like a blueprint to be stress-tested, you are validating the text's exact concern. You are ignoring the relational reality of the room. When you poke a hole in their blueprint, they don't look at you and feel immense gratitude for your engineering prowess. They feel invalidated.
Not necessarily.
They feel you are opposing them. The text states very clearly that effective negotiation relies more on mutual understanding than on the ability to impose one's arguments.
I hear that, but let me provide a clear contrast of what this actually sounds like in practice. If I take an adversarial, purely argumentative posture, I might say, your expansion strategy is flawed because your regional churn rate is 15% too high and the math doesn't support the investment.
Which is a bludgeon.
Exactly. It creates opposition. But what if I use collaborative argumentation? What if I say, because we both want this new division to succeed and protect your legacy, we need to look at how this 15% churn rate impacts our shared financial runway?
Okay, that is softer.
That is still an argument. It is still based on evidence and logic, but it is empathetic. How does one reach the mutual understanding the text so highly prizes without explaining the why and how of their own position?
You reach it through deep, active listening, through empathetic inquiry, through consciously suspending your own desire to convince the other person.
I wholeheartedly agree that active listening is paramount in the early stages. But eventually, the listening has to translate into an agreement. And an agreement requires proposing terms, defining boundaries, and justifying those choices.
But at what cost to the relationship?
The text specifically criticizes the ability to impose one's arguments, quoting, no matter how brilliant they may be. And I take real issue with the implication that crafting a brilliant, logically sound argument is inherently a selfish act of imposition.
Well, let's dig into that.
A brilliant argument can be a deeply empathetic act of synthesis. It can be the very tool that illuminates an underlying interest the other party didn't even realize they had. A brilliant argument doesn't have to be a weapon. It can be a bridge built out of shared facts and mutual reality.
I want to zero in on this concept of the brilliant argument because it gets to the absolute core of the cognitive mechanics of negotiation. If you are sitting across from me and your mental energy is devoted to constructing a brilliant argument, gathering your facts, structuring your premises, anticipating my counterpoints to ensure your logic is flawless, you are engaged in a highly demanding cognitive task.
Of course it's demanding.
So here is my challenge to you. Human cognition has bandwidth limits. If you are deeply focused on deploying a brilliant argument, is it cognitively possible for you to simultaneously maintain the deep, mutual understanding of my underlying interests that the text requires?
That is a highly incisive question. It speaks directly to the cognitive load of the negotiator in real time.
Exactly. The text suggests that the pursuit of this logical brilliance is, at its core, a selfish act. It prioritizes the speaker's intellect over the listener's emotional reality. You physically cannot hold space for my complex emotional state. You cannot pick up on the micro-expressions of hesitation or the subtle shifts in tone if your working memory is operating like a debate champion looking for the fatal flaw in my logic.
I see what you're saying, but
It is a single-threaded process. You are either analyzing my logic to defeat it, or you are absorbing my emotional reality to understand it. You cannot do both simultaneously at a high level.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That assumes human cognition is rigidly single-threaded in a way that entirely precludes empathy during analysis. Let's look at the mechanism of what makes an argument truly brilliant in a collaborative setting.
Okay.
A brilliant argument in a negotiation is not a static monologue drafted in isolation before the meeting begins. It is a dynamic framework
formulated in response to the emotional and relational data you are gathering in real time.
But you're still formulating a framework.
Yes, but if I am truly listening to you, my logical framework is constantly adapting to include your emotional realities as critical variables. The brilliance of the argument is not in its rigidity or its mathematical perfection in a vacuum, but in its capacity to logically synthesize my constraints with your emotional needs.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because I want you to notice the vocabulary you just naturally used. Synthesize my constraints with your emotional needs as variables. You are still reducing the human experience to an equation.
That's just the terminology.
But this is the exact paradox the source material is warning us about. You are taking a tool, argumentation, which works beautifully in a court of law or a mathematics symposium, and you are forcing it onto a dynamic that relies fundamentally on emotional trust. When people feel that they are being treated as variables in your brilliant logical synthesis, the trust evaporates.
I wouldn't say it evaporates.
The relationship degrades. And returning to the underground analogy, you're just drawing sharper, more brilliant lines on a map of the subway while we are both drowning in the ocean. Without the relationship, the negotiation fails, no matter how perfectly you mapped out the facts.
That is a very fair critique of how logic can be severely misapplied if it is devoid of genuine empathy. But we have to look at the practical alternative the text implies.
Which is what?
Well, if we completely abandon argumentation, if we intentionally stop bringing evidence and logical reasoning to the table because we are so terrified of creating a dynamic of opposition or triggering an amygdala hijack, what are we actually left with?
Mutual understanding?
We are left with a negotiation based entirely on sentiment. We are left with two parties trying to make each other feel good without any reliable mechanism to adjudicate competing scarce resources. Let's go back to our acquisition scenario.
Sure.
If both the buyer and the founder want control over the new innovation lab, emotional awareness will tell us that both parties feel deeply connected to it. Both have valid emotional reasons for wanting it. But emotional awareness cannot divide the lab. Empathy cannot draft the operating agreement.
Obviously not, but
Logic divides the lab. Evidence determines the fair allocation of resources. Without argumentation, mutual understanding simply becomes mutual paralysis.
I don't believe the text is advocating for mutual paralysis, nor is it suggesting we abandon facts entirely. It is warning us against a specific hierarchical ranking of our tools. It is saying that when we elevate argumentation to be the main tool of the negotiator, when we reach for it first, we inherently block success.
So it's a matter of timing for you?
It is about sequence and prioritization. If you enter the room prioritizing logical reasoning, you will inevitably create the opposition the text describes. You will trigger the debate dynamic. If instead, you prioritize relational aspects and mutual understanding as the primary objective, the facts can exist in the room without becoming weapons. The obstacle isn't the existence of evidence. The obstacle is the reliance on argumentation as the primary vehicle for human interaction.
That is a crucial distinction, and perhaps where the truest nuances of the source text lie. It is a question of sequence. However, I would still argue that even in a highly relational, emotionally attuned negotiation, the moment you transition from understanding the problem to actually solving it, you are re-engaging argumentation.
By proposing a solution.
Exactly. The moment you say, because you need autonomy for your legacy and I need oversight for my shareholders, therefore this specific board structure is the optimal solution, you are making a logical argument. To pretend it isn't an argument is to obscure the actual mechanics of how durable agreements are forged.
So let's bring this together and summarize where we stand on this incredibly complex issue. My position, drawn deeply from the text, is that relying on argumentation creates a rigid oppositional dynamic. It assumes a level of rationality in decision-making that simply does not reflect human psychology or neuroscience.
Right?
By prioritizing a logical reasoning and the presentation of evidence, negotiators risk blinding themselves to the complex emotional and relational realities that are actually driving the behavior of the person sitting across the table. When we try to win a debate, we lose the opportunity for true, creative collaboration based on underlying interests.
And my summary is that while emotional and relational awareness are undeniably vital for creating a safe environment,
Logical argumentation remains the essential scaffolding required to negotiate effectively. Without the ability to clearly articulate evidence and reason through complex, competing interests, mutual understanding cannot be translated into actionable, durable agreements.
Arguments do not have to be adversarial. When used collaboratively, they are the very mechanism by which we illuminate hidden interests and logically stress test our mutual solutions so they survive in the real world.
What is fascinating is that despite our divergent frameworks, we have found a significant point of convergence centered on the text's primary warning. We both agree that entering a negotiation with the sole intent to win an exchange, to forcefully impose your will upon the other party through sheer intellectual dominance, is inherently destructive.
Completely.
It triggers a defensive physiological response and shuts down the exact type of mutual understanding necessary for any successful outcome.
Absolutely. The adversarial posture is a guaranteed path to failure, regardless of how good your data is. Where our disagreement remains entrenched, however, is on the nature of the tool itself. You see argumentation as the inherent culprit that inevitably leads to that adversarial posture, whereas I see argumentation as a neutral, entirely necessary tool that has simply been misused by negotiators who lack relational intelligence.
It highlights the deep complexity of human communication that this material brings to the surface. Navigating the tension between logical persuasion and emotional intelligence isn't a puzzle to be solved once and forgotten. It is a continuous moment-to-moment challenge in every professional and personal interaction we have.
It really requires an incredible amount of self-awareness. You have to know when to be the architect building the logical framework and when to put the blueprints down and simply exist in the relational space with the other person.
Exactly. And it leaves us with a profound question to evaluate in our own lives. The next time you find yourself sitting across a table trying to reach an agreement on something that truly matters, you have to stop and ask yourself, are you trying to accurately read the unpredictable ocean you are actually floating in, or are you still stubbornly trying to navigate it with the perfectly logical map of the London Underground? We'll leave you to ponder which tool you will prioritize.